We are Life Church Livonia.
All right, good morning, Life Church Livonia. You guys were just talking about what the hardest piece of furniture to move, and asked me in between services about the couch that I had to move into Jamie's apartment in college and the way we took it up the outside of the fire escape. Great story. We'll talk about that in between services. I would love to get to know you anyway. My name is Brian. I'm the pastor here, and we are so excited you chose to join us this morning here in church. And our hope for you is that you would experience something really beautiful here today, that you would experience family and community in a way you've never experienced it before, and that you would learn more about what it looks like to be a part of a church, be a part of a community that follows after Jesus and has a relationship with God that changes their lives. And really, that's what we are all about. And so over the last few weeks, what we've been doing is helping you to understand what does it look like to become a blessing to people so that more people could experience what we experience here. That's been the burning question in our hearts, in our minds. How do we become a blessing to the world? And our hope is that as we change our behavior, as we change the way we engage people around us, that we would actually end up changing their view of who God is in light of their interactions with God's people. So that as we become a blessing to the world, that we would actually change their view of God because we change the way they view God's people. This is huge, and I think it's possible. And we've been doing that by looking at missional practices, missional habits that we can actually begin to incorporate into our lives in a way that allows us to become a blessing. And it spells out, these missional habits, they all spell out the word bless. And so it's an acronym, and we want to start by reviewing because we are on the final week today. And we start with prayer. We begin with prayer. And we're asked God the question, how can I be a blessing today? We started as a church by asking God, who are the people in my life that you want me to be a blessing to? And all of these cards you see on the cross here are names you turned in, 500 names. Turned in saying, we choose to be a blessing to these people. We are going to be praying for these people throughout this entire series. My hope is that you're continuing to pray for those people even when the series is over, because God uses prayer to do miraculous things. But after we pray, we begin with prayer, then God brings people to us to bless. And the very important first step when we engage those people is to learn to listen with care. We have to learn to listen to people, to listen to their hopes and their dreams and their struggles and their successes, to what they actually are interested in. We have to learn to listen to people. And this takes practice, but it's a skill that can be developed. Any person can become a great listener. And not only do we listen to people, but we also we make it a missional habit to eat together. That eating together is one of the best ways to build community. It is a really easy way for us just to sit around a table and to share a meal and get to know one another. We're doing it with our new neighbors lately. We have new neighbors to the south of us, and we've been eating a lot together, even if it's just a simple s'more around a campfire, and it really has helped build community. Also, what helps is that my son is addicted to s'mores, and every time they have a campfire, he runs over and asks if they can have s'mores. So it's been beautiful. We've been eating together a lot. It's been a lot of s'mores, and I love it. I love that we're building community in that way. But we have to go beyond just listening and eating together, and we move on to serving in love. That we're actually saying, as we're listening, we're hearing those needs come out, and we're seeing the need and meeting the need, not waiting for someone else to do so. What does it look like to step in and serve people with love? But the final S in this whole journey is to share your story. It's to share your story. And it really is connected deeply with 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. When they say, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be prepared to give an answer. For the reason that you're doing all these things. Because if we live into these missional practices, if we live out in this manner that it becomes a blessing to the world, it will naturally lead to questions about why you're doing what you're doing. People will naturally become curious, like, what's up with Brian? Like, why is he doing that? And hopefully, we live questionable lives. Not questionable in a sketchy kind of questionable way, but questionable in the sense that our lives cause people to ask questions. And 1 Peter 3:15 says we have to be ready, always ready, to give an answer to someone when they come to us and they say, what's the deal? What's the deal with you? And I want to be really clear about what we're talking about here. We're talking about your God story. We're talking about the story of the way that God has come into your life and changed things, the way you met God, the way that God transformed you, the way that you experienced crazy love and incredible grace, the way that your life was transformed from one type of living, one type of life to something that is completely new. This is a story that we're talking about. This is the story that all of this leads us to. And it's scary for a lot of us to even begin thinking about sharing that kind of story. And I love what Tim Keller says about it. He says, we shouldn't love people in order to share our faith with them. We shouldn't love people in order to share our faith with them. We don't bless people. We don't choose to engage people because they're a target for us, like a bullseye for us. That dehumanizes them. It makes them feel like less of a person. And if you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus, we don't want to bless you because you're a target for us. We want to bless you because you have value, deep value as a human being. You are known and loved by God, and God longs for you to know and love him. That's why we want to bless you. So we shouldn't love people in order to share our faith with them. Rather, we share our faith with them. We share ourselves with them in order to love them. This is one of the ways we express our love, is to share a part of our story, and the part of our story that was transformed by God. And I believe that everything will change about your and my willingness to share our stories with people when we begin to grasp that this is true. When we actually begin to believe that sharing our story is an act of love. And when we withhold our story, we are depriving people from an opportunity to actually experience the love of God for themselves. When we withhold our story, we are depriving people of an opportunity to experience something amazing. And everything will change about your willingness to share your story when you actually get this. When God changes your mind about this. And you could say, out of all of the letters that we've explored, out of all of the missional practices that we've explored during this series, that this is not only the most important, but it's actually the most challenging. And we could go back and honestly look at all the other practices and realize that in a lot of ways, the other things are easy compared to this. As you start looking at prayer, prayer can be a very private exercise. It can be something that you do privately that no one ever knows about. It doesn't cause you to step out deeply in faith until you actually do what the Lord tells you in prayer. So prayer can be done privately. Listening, it takes practice, but it's something that is honestly easy for us to do if we choose to do it. And it's not threatening at all. And so listening, actually, I would say, is one of the most non-threatening things you could ever do for someone. You just sit and you listen and you hear their story and you genuinely engage them deeply with your heart and with your eyes and with your mind. Listening is non-threatening. Eating is a basic human necessity. It's something that all of us have to do every single day. And it's not a huge leap to just simply invite someone else to sit at the same table with you. Serving people is a universally accepted act of love. Everyone likes to be served. It might make some people a little bit uncomfortable to receive, but at the end of the day, everyone loves to be served. And so it's universally accepted as a means of blessing people. But then we get to this idea of sharing our story, and we start hearing verses like 1 Peter 3:15 that tells us to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that we have. We read 1 Peter 3:15, and we hear that when we bless people and they come back and they say, why did you do what you did? You're supposed to give them your story, and we start to be really uncomfortable. Even though it should be the very best story that we have ever told in our entire life, the greatest story that we ever are privileged to share, we become more worried about what people think of us than whether or not they're still far from God. This should make us a little uncomfortable, just even hearing that. And this is the hard voice of the day of saying, listen, we get more worried about what people think of us than whether or not they find their way back to God. Sharing our story is a critical part of being a blessing to the world. And so we come up with a long list of reasons why we struggle to do it. And I just want to acknowledge that this is hard for a lot of people. For some of us, it's difficult to have any kind of a conversation, let alone a conversation that matters. And so I want to acknowledge that it's difficult, but I just want to remind you that it's so important. And I want to kind of debunk a few of the common excuses that we put out there and the reasons why we don't. And the first is this. We say, I'd love to share my story, but I don't know what to say. I don't know what I would even say to someone to engage that. And we're worried that somehow if we did say something about our faith or did say something about the story of God in our life, that they would ask us a question that we wouldn't know the answer to, right? How many of, let's just be honest, how many have ever worried about this? That if you shared your story, tell me, yeah, right. You're like, okay, if I share my story, they'd ask a question I don't know the answer to, and I'm not an expert on the Pentateuch. In fact, I don't even know what the Pentateuch is. You don't have to be an expert on this. When we're talking about sharing your story, there is no one on the planet that knows your story better than you. You are the preeminent expert on your story. So if you had a topic or a skill set that you were the leading authority in the entire world on that topic, people would come to you and want to know about it, and you would have no trouble sharing. That's the truth about your story. And when we talk about sharing your story, no one is better equipped to do it than you. It takes willingness. Don't worry about what you have to say. Just share your life with people. Another issue that we have is that we convince ourselves that we have to wait for the perfect time. We're like, I'm just going to wait for that perfect moment when everything aligns. Maybe it's like the solar eclipse. Like you've been waiting for the solar eclipse for the last 18 years so you can share your story. That's a terrible analogy, sorry. That is not the perfect time. There is no perfect time. It's like saying I'm going to wait for the perfect time to have children. There is no perfect time to have children. They will disrupt your life no matter when you have them. This is truth, right? If you're waiting for the perfect time to step in and share your story with that friend of yours that is far from God, I want to tell you right now, there is no perfect time. The perfect time is the time that you actually step out in courage and do it. That's the perfect time. We struggle because we're fearful of offending someone. This is huge in our culture right now. We are really worried that by sharing our story that we will offend someone. And this is what I'm convinced of, is that we offend people when we judge other people's stories, not when we share ours. We offend people when we judge their story, when we look at their story and we say, let me tell you everything that's wrong with your story. Let me explain to you why the way you're living your life is jacked up. That's when we offend people. We don't offend people simply by sharing our own story. Share your story. Share the story of the way that you met God, the way that God has transformed your life, and let God do God's part. This is huge. We can stop worrying about offending people when all we do is share our story. But we struggle also that maybe our lives already tell the story, and we convince ourselves that our lives already tell the story, and we say, well, listen, I don't actually have to say anything because I'm living it out. And we go back and we try to quote St. Francis of Assisi, and we say, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. And I've heard people say, this is how I share the gospel. This is how I share the good news. I model my life after St. Francis, right? Preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. And the problem is that he never said that. He never said it. You've probably heard people preach this, that this is what St. Francis said. But if you go back and you pour through all of his writings, and all of the biographers that wrote about him, all of them agree he never said it. It's something he might have been in favor of. And if he had said this, what he would have meant by it is, make sure your life matches your words. Make sure that your life matches your words, but make sure your words match your life. Both of those things are important. I love this because part of it's true that we do have to live out the gospel, but we have to also speak out the good news. The good news does not become good news until it's spoken. What if you were brimming over with good news? What if something happened in your life that you couldn't wait to tell someone, and you got home and you're super bubbly, like crazy energetic, and everyone around you can tell that something is going on? And they say to you, what's going on? And you're like, it's really good. Seriously? Like, tell me now. They're like, I can't tell you. It's super good. Have you ever known someone that had a secret that they weren't supposed to tell you? But you could tell they had a secret that they weren't supposed to tell you? Because it was this amazing news and they couldn't wait to share it. It's like the person that finds out that they're expecting, the person that got a promotion, but they're not allowed to tell anyone that they got the promotion because other people didn't get the promotion. And they're brimming over with this good news. And they can't wait to say it. But eventually, it has to come out in order for that good news to be shared. Our words are critical. They're important. That we always are ready to give an answer for the reason behind our hope. You can't spell bless without the final S. We can't truly live fully into what it looks like to be a blessing to the world without the final S of sharing our story. And one of the goals of this entire series, of this entire practice of these missional habits, is that our lives would become like an amazing movie trailer for the rule and the reign of God, for the good news of the gospel, for the opportunity that people have to be in a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. One of our goals is that your lives, my life, would become like a really great movie trailer for who God is. And everyone knows that when you go to see movies and a really good movie trailer comes on, what's the first thing you do when the movie trailer, they're not supposed to talk during the movies, but my wife and I do this every single time. I see a great movie trailer, I lean over to it, I say, we've got to see that. Like, I can't wait to see that. Or I'll lean over and say, that looks terrible. We should never watch that movie. Like, I don't want to, or I'll lean over and say, we should wait until that comes out, like, on Netflix. Like, it looks kind of okay. I'm not super interested. I would watch it for free, but not if I had to pay for it. But what if our lives were like movie trailers that told the story of God? And not just a lame movie trailer where you're like, no way am I seeing that ever. Even if I got that for free at a garage sale on DVD, I would not watch it. But what if our lives actually told the story of God in a beautiful way? That's what happens when we live into these missional habits. Our lives become a trailer for something that's way bigger and way more beautiful than us. I want to give you an example of how this happened recently in our lives. Not just in my life, but in the life of our church. One of our staff members, Jeff Kaiser, and his wife, Becca, moved into a new apartment just a few weeks ago. And a bunch of us showed up to help move them in. In fact, it was one of those moments when more people showed up probably than you needed, and so the task goes really, really fast. And we got them moved in record time, and as we were kind of unloading the final boxes and getting everything kind of wrapped up, I noticed that just in the apartment complex one apartment complex north of them, that there was another family that had just pulled up with a truck full of stuff. And this was a much bigger truck than the truck that Jeff and Becca had just unloaded. And so I'm thinking inside my head, I should go downstairs and grab all the guys from our church, and we should go over next door and help them move in. And so as I start to move downstairs to say to the guys, hey, we should go help them, the guys were already there. They'd already started. I was like, go church. I had a total pastor proud moment. I hid in the bushes and cried for a second. I was so proud of everyone, and then I went over and helped join them and help move these people in. And it was a lot of stuff, and some of it was big, heavy furniture. And I'm not kidding you, I think we moved them into their apartment in like 20 minutes. It was insane, crazy. And over again, these people kept saying, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You wouldn't believe this. This would have taken us all night. As I'm carrying a couch in with one of the guys that was going to live in this apartment, he's saying to me, once again, thank you, this is such a big deal. Like, what? What caused you to want to come over here and do this? Actually, in this moment, this is exactly what happened. I'm not making this up. And I was able to say in that moment, well, we're Christians, and all of us go to the same church, and this is just what God calls us to do, to be a blessing to people. I was like, for the win, boom, yeah. Perfect sermon illustration, people. But we didn't do it for a sermon illustration. And we didn't do it because they were a target. We didn't do it because we were like, we're going to win them to the gospel. We did it because it's the right thing to do, and it opened up a doorway to something beautiful. And I was able to say, I'm actually the pastor at that church, and this is the kind of church we want to be. The kind of church that would stop what they're doing and go and help someone else move in. And that's it. I haven't talked to those people yet. And my prayer for them is that they would have many more opportunities for people to step up and step in and give them a reason for their hope, a reason for their action, a reason that they have chosen to become a blessing, because my heart longs for people like them to be saved. That's what my heart longs for. And my heart mirrors the heart of the Apostle Paul for his people. You look at Romans chapter 10, I love this. And you see Paul's heart poured out. He says, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God on behalf of my fellow Israelites is for their salvation. Paul knew that his brothers and sisters, the people that were part of his nation, his people, they were missing out on one of the richest experiences of his entire life. That they had a portion of this relationship with God, right? And they were almost there. But what was missing was something he had. This opportunity to experience God in a beautiful way. And he said, with all my heart and with all of my prayers, I cry out to God on behalf of my fellow Israelites that they too might be saved. And what if this became our prayer for the city of Livonia, for the city of Farmington and Westland and Redford and all of the surrounding communities? What if we took Paul's statement and made it our own? What if we said, my heart's desire and our prayer to God on behalf of the people in Livonia is that they would enter into a life-giving relationship with God? Paul knew the truth, and he longed to share that part of his story with his people. And the truth that he knew is found just a few verses later in Romans 10:13. He says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. He had experienced this. Paul had called in the name of the Lord. He had had an experience with Jesus. He had been saved. He had experienced God in such a beautiful and life-transformative manner that he couldn't wait to tell other people about it. He was brimming over with the good news. This is Paul. But then he asks some really good questions that I think are questions that you and I need to wrestle with today. He says this in Romans 10:14. How are they to call on one they have not believed in? And how are they to believe in one they have not heard of? And how are they to hear without someone preaching to them? He's like, duh, people. You're brimming over with the gospel of the good news, but how are they going to hear unless someone actually tells them about it? How are they to believe unless they know what it is they're called to believe in? How are they to be saved if they don't even know how to be? At some point, when we go through the B and the L and the E and the S, we have to get to the final S and share our story. And as we read this verse, I don't want you to get hung up on the word preach. Because oftentimes when you see a word like someone preaching to them, you're like, whew, sweet, it's the pastor's job. And listen, I'll be faithful in that. But this word preach, it's not just translated preach. It's translated proclaim. It's translated talk. It's translated tell. This is all of our jobs. To proclaim the good news of what God has done in our life and to point people in the direction where they can experience that too. Every single one of us is called to tell our story. There will never be a moment in your engagement with people to be a blessing when words aren't necessary. At some point, words will always be necessary. And sometimes people are closer than you think. Multiple times in the last month and a half at our church, someone has gotten invited to church. Someone has experienced the blessing of a member of our church. Someone has experienced what it looks like to be served well, to be loved well, and they've become curious about what's different about that person. And both times I'm thinking of in my head right now, the people that knew this individual didn't even know that they were gospel curious. But they were faithful enough to invite them to church and to say, hey, come and see what it's about. And they came here and they gave their life to Christ. It's amazing. Multiple times during this series that's happened because you guys were faithful to allow someone to come in and hear the story. And both times that happened, though, these individuals had no idea that they were right there. And we're waiting for the perfect moment to invite. We're waiting for the perfect moment to tell. And that perfect moment does not exist. You create it. God creates it for you, and you step into it. My brothers and sisters, my heart is longing for the people of Livonia to experience salvation, to experience what it looks like to have a life-giving relationship with Jesus Christ. But how? My heart echoes Paul's. How are they to believe in one they have not heard of? How are they to hear without someone preaching to them? And he goes on, and how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how timely is the arrival of those who proclaim good news. Have you ever been in a situation where you desperately needed good news, and then someone shows up with the good news? How timely is that? Is there ever a bad time for that? When you're really struggling, when you're wrestling and things aren't going the way you want them to do, and maybe you're short on your rent check that month, and then suddenly, oh my goodness, you wouldn't believe what happened. I got a bonus at work, and it's exactly the amount we need to pay our rent. Is there ever a bad time to share that? No. What about if you're driving down the highway, like happened to my wife and my daughter recently, and they run out of gas, and miraculously a state trooper rolls up and he says, "Hey, I got you. I have a gas can in the back of my car." There is never a bad time for that to happen unless it never happens. How timely is the arrival of those who proclaim good news. And he says, how are they to preach unless they're sent? And this is what I want you to know. I will faithfully proclaim the good news every single Sunday, but I'm not the only one who's called and sent. All of us are. If you call yourself a follower of Jesus, you are sent too. You have everything in you needed to share your story. You just have to be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. You have to be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. I just got back from Alaska. I shared a little bit about it in my sermon last week. We used to live there, and we went back on vacation. And I couldn't wait to share some of my stories when I got back. If you hung out with me at all in the first few days when I got back from Alaska, you heard about Alaska. And so I was looking for ways to insert Alaska into all the conversations because I was excited about it. In fact, it might be annoying because you're like, I would like to go to Alaska and not just hear about it from you. I was brimming over with this excitement, right? I couldn't wait to show pictures of the fish that my kids caught, the first salmon that my kids caught ever on a fly rod. It was amazing. I couldn't wait to insert that trip into my conversation. But what if we couldn't wait to talk about what God did in our life? What if we couldn't wait to start a conversation that mattered? And we were brimming over, not with this weird intent to convert people, but this beautiful just openness about God's transformative work in your life. What if we couldn't wait to start a conversation that matters? And if we did that, what would we even do? What would you say? In its simplest form, the way that we teach people to share their story is to break it down into parts. A before, a during, and an after. The first, this before, we teach people, just share what your life was like before Jesus. What was missing in your life? It's a really simple thing to share. This is what it was like before I met Jesus. And some of you are like, well, I met Jesus when I was 6, and so I don't even remember. That's okay. That's a beautiful part of your story. I'm praising God that was your story. But then you have a during story. Like, what happened? At what point did God become real to you? At what point did you actually make a commitment to follow Jesus? At what point did your faith become your own? Did you own it? Just share that simple part of your story. And then the after. What happened? What's happened since then? How has God affected your life? How has God changed your life? And if the answer is that God hasn't, then we have to have a different conversation about what it looks like to engage God and to grow in your relationship. We need to get you into a discipleship group. We need to get you into a small group so you can learn that after Jesus comes something amazing. It's a life-transformative process. This is the simplest form of sharing your story, but it almost seems formulaic. It works really, really well in formal settings. It works great when we get people up on stage to share their story. It works great when someone actually says, hey, could you share your whole story about following Jesus? And you can walk through the whole thing. But the reality of it is, in our life, we very rarely have a situation where this kind of story works from beginning to end. We get interrupted. We get phone calls. We share part of it, and then questions come up, and then we answer all those questions, and we never get to the during or the after, and all we shared was the before. Or maybe all we shared was the after, and sometimes we go in reverse order, and we talk about the changes that God's made in our life, and people are like, well, how did that happen? And then we share our moment when we committed our life to Jesus, and then we start slowly unpacking what our life was like before. It doesn't have to go perfect. It doesn't have to go in a certain order. What has to happen is we have to be willing to actually share pieces of it. Break it up if you need to. Share one part one day, and another part the next month, and another part the month after that. But share your story. I love what Rick Richardson says about this. He gives us some questions to kind of ponder. He says, when in your life was God most real to you? When has your encounter with Jesus been most influential? When have you most connected to the reality of the spiritual side of life? That's your crucial story to learn to share. That's the story that will be most relevant for you as a guide to others in their spiritual journey. When was God most real to you? When did prayer work? These are the stories to stuff in the back of your brain, to have ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. I was thinking about moments in my life when this has happened, and more often than not, for me, it's happened when people ask questions about prayer. And so I remember vividly a moment when I was hanging out with a couple of students. So I think there were 3 or 4 students there, and one of them was really struggling in a situation in their life, and they weren't followers of Jesus, and I just said, I would love to pray for you. Is it okay if I pray for you? And one of the students said, do you really believe that works? And I was like, yeah, I totally believe that works. It was an opportunity to share a story, and so I just said, you want to hear a story about a time in my life when prayer worked? And of course they said yes. Who wouldn't want to hear that story, right? I simply said, you want to hear a story about a time when prayer actually worked in my life? And I shared a story about a time when I prayed for a miracle and a crazy miracle happened. I've shared some of those stories here on the stage. And they were like, no way did that happen. I'm like, yes, it did happen. This is my story. And I said, you want to hear another one? Yeah, we want to hear. Now they're hungry for a story. And I shared another story about a time when prayer transformed something that was amazing. I shared like 3 or 4 stories with those kids. And at the end of that time, I had shared a story that had led them one step closer to Jesus. None of those kids chose to follow Jesus that day. They didn't instantly get transformed into Christians. They didn't instantly choose to follow God. But I was faithful in that moment to share a piece of my God story for other people to engage in something that changed my life forever. It takes faithfulness. When in your life was God most real to you? When has your encounter with Jesus been most influential? When have you been most connected to the reality of the spiritual side of life? That's your crucial story to share. And one of the best ways to share your story, if you want to do it in its complete form, if you just want to go all in, you're like, I want to be all in for sharing my story, one of the best ways to do that is to choose to step into the tank and be baptized. Baptism is this beautiful opportunity for us as a church to celebrate something that happened inside of someone. We always say that baptism is an outward sign of an inward reality. It's an outward sign of an inward reality. It's an opportunity for someone to stand up in front of the entire church proclaiming that I am following Jesus. We take video of people's stories and we show videos of what your life was like before and how you met Jesus and what your life has been like after. We help you tell your story, and then you step into a tank of water and we baptize you and you identify with the death of Jesus. And then when you come up out of the water, you identify with the resurrection, the new life that Jesus gives, and you tell your story to a ton of your friends and family. And I know there are people that come to this church that you have made a commitment to follow Jesus, or you have recommitted your life to following Christ, and you're ready to tell your story, and baptism is a beautiful way to do that. In your bulletins this morning, you'll find a card. It's an opportunity to sign up for baptism. And if you fill this card out, don't worry. If you're like, man, I'm not sure whether I want to do this, just fill the card out anyway. It helps me to have a conversation with you. It's the beginning of a process. It's not a binding contract. If you fill it out today and you're like, you put it in the offering plate later and you're like, darn it, I shouldn't have done that. I haven't even talked to my wife about that, or I haven't thought about this very much. But if you're feeling like, I'm really led to do this, God has changed my life, and I am ready to be baptized. Just write your name on that card and put it in the offering plate when it passes by in a little bit later in our service. We would love to walk through that journey with you and give you a place to share your story. You know what's funny about that is that people often say to me, well, I want to get baptized, but I don't want to share my story. You wouldn't believe how often I hear that. I want to be baptized, but I'm afraid to tell my story. And that's why we video them. That's why we help you. Your story is beautiful. And your story might be the key that unlocks your best friend's heart. Your story might be the key that unlocks the heart of your father who doesn't come to church ever. Your story might be the critical moment in someone else's story. And we have an obligation to share it. We have an opportunity to share it. Be brave, be bold to start a conversation. And ultimately, what the story that we're talking about is the story of Jesus in us. And so today, as we come to this table, this communion table, really what we do in communion is we have an opportunity to remember Jesus' story in us, to step into that experience, to remember that Jesus, he went to the cross and he died for us so that we might have a relationship with God. He took on the penalty of our mistakes, of our sins, and if we're willing to turn, to repent, meaning that repentance means to turn away from something, to turn away from an old life and to choose to step into a new life, that Jesus will make that possible through his death and his resurrection. And we know that what happened is that the night before he was betrayed, Jesus was sitting with his closest followers, and he broke bread, and he said, "This is my body broken for you." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup and he said, this cup, it represents the blood that's about to be shed, and it's a new covenant, a new promise, a new commitment between myself and you, that as often as you eat the bread and you drink the cup, you proclaim. Remember that word, proclaim? You tell, you talk, you preach the good news as often as you eat the bread and you drink the cup. Even simple, mundane, beautiful experiences like eating bread and drinking from a cup are opportunities to tell the story of Jesus. And so we come. And if you're a follower of Jesus, we invite you to partake. And the way we do that is we'll have our ushers come through, and they're going to pass out opportunities for little pieces of bread. And they're going to pass little cups of juice. And if you are gluten-free, you can just dive in because it's gluten-free. We want everyone to be able to be at this table. And if you call yourself a Christian, we invite you to it. You don't have to be a member at our church. You just need to have a relationship with Jesus. And maybe today, you are that person that's right on the edge. And maybe for you today, this could be your first communion. And the way we do that is by offering ourselves to Jesus. And so I just want to pray for you right now. I want to pray for boldness for those who are ready to share their story. And I want to pray for boldness for the person who's sitting here today knowing that God is calling you. Would you pray with me? So Jesus, we just take a pause here. Take a deep breath. Let go of our anxieties, our fears. And maybe the fear that we're feeling is the fear of sharing our story, because we know that we have not been bold enough to start conversations. And so, God, if that is you in this place, I just ask for the people that are here today to have boldness, courage, fearlessness with their story. And if you're sitting here today and you don't have a story yet to tell, if you don't have a God story yet to tell, my prayer is that right now, this moment would be yours. And that as you sit here in the quiet of this room, that you would simply in your heart say to Jesus, I want you. I want to be saved. I want to be in a life-giving relationship. And I choose to leave all of my past behind, all of my mistakes, all of my concerns, all my cares. Jesus, I just give them all to you, and I turn from that to you. I choose to commit myself to you. I choose to come back to you. I place my trust in you, God, alone. Jesus, we love you. We are so happy to be able to serve you and to be a blessing to the people that you bring us into contact with every single day. Transform our hearts and minds for your sake. Thank you. We love you. We worship you in this place. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ.